Spring practice is in the air here in the Big Ten, and spring breeds optimism. I'm very optimistic about two teams within the former Big Ten West that could be surprise teams in the conference in 2025. Speaking of next season, I've got three keys for the Nebraska Cornhuskers to take that typical Matt Rhule year 3 bump in 2025. USC has had all kinds of recruiting success for the class of 2026, and that recruiting success, it's just another death blow to the SEC and another notch in the Big Ten's belt. This is Big Nation.
From Pasadena to Piscataway, College Park to the Coliseum, Seattle to State College, Columbus to Camp Randall, the Zoo to the Rock, and everywhere in between. This is where Big Ten fans gather to talk America's premier national conference with your host, Big Ten Ted. All Big Ten, all year long. This is Big Nation.
All of the talk entering March Madness and this NCAA men's basketball tournament was SEC, what they get 14 teams into this thing, but the Big Ten at one point before Wisconsin lost to BYU in the second round, the Big Ten started off 10-0, including winning every single one of their first round tournament games. So a fantastic start and a fantastic showing for the Big Ten to really start this thing off. Hey, maybe some teams certainly bowed out in the second round and weren't able to maybe punch their ticket to the Sweet 16, but overall, I think a pretty decent showing so far from the Big Ten Conference in one of my favorite sporting events of the year in March Madness. Now, pivoting over to football, that's what this channel and that's what this show is certainly all about. We know the Big Ten's success this past season, and we know about the growing national discussion points that the Big Ten is really starting to inch on the territory of the SEC and become the best conference in college football. Heck, I already think they're there. I already thought that they were making those waves and those moves in 2023 when you had current Big Ten champion Michigan playing future Big Ten member and final Pac-12 champion Washington in the national championship game. And I think this year, when you look at what happened in the college football playoff with two Big Ten teams making it into the semifinals, and then what you saw throughout all of bowl season, the Big Ten getting the upper hand of the SEC in a lot of these bowl matchups. We know, you and I know, where college football is really going and how strong the Big Ten is right now. But there is one thing. There is one thing I think that the Big Ten is restaking their claim to, and one Big Ten school is reclaiming their territory, and that is not what the SEC certainly wants to hear right now. And it is the USC Trojans and that Southern California recruiting market. USC has the number 2 recruiting class in college football right now. Chad Bowden, coming in as the general manager, has done a phenomenal job at doing what USC should have been doing this whole time and focusing around Southern California and Los Angeles. It is one of the top ripe recruiting areas for talent in all of college football. But here's why this is great. It's obviously great for USC. They're getting great talent, but it's great for the Big Ten because it is a little bit of a death blow to the SEC. Now, when USC had not been recruiting Southern California as well, where did a lot of those players go? That's what I really want to start with here. Oregon, up there in the Pacific Northwest, they kind of came in and they took advantage of that opportunity, and they were able to nab a lot of good, high-quality high school players. They certainly have a head start, and they're certainly still very much in Southern California. Heck, they're just below USC, number 3 in these recruiting rankings for the class of 2026 right now. But where did all this other talent go? Where maybe if they didn't go to Oregon, where did this Southern California talent go? The SEC, they saw an opportunity. Alabama is a school specifically that saw an opportunity. There's already all kinds of talent in the southeast portion of America, but the SEC was able to get top tier players from Southern California when USC was not able to really dominate that area. And now that USC in this class of 2026, along with Oregon, but as long with what USC is doing right now, that brings more high quality talent, of course, to the Trojans, and thus it brings more high quality talent to the Big Ten Conference. Like, for example, you go back to the 2020 class, Bryce Young, who was originally committed to USC, he flipped over to Alabama. DJ Uiagalelei, he went to Clemson, although maybe he didn't have the greatest career in the world. CJ Stroud went to Ohio State. All were top 40 players in the country as quarterbacks in Southern California. And USC didn't get a single one. When you have that much high-quality quarterback talent, I know this was pre-Lincoln Riley, but considering the track record that you had at the quarterback position at USC, that is inexcusable. In 2021, Texas and Georgia signed 2 players in the top 5 in the state of California. Oh, they just ended up being Xavier Worthy and Brock Bowers. You fast forward to 2024, Alabama signed the top 2 players in the state, and the SEC as a whole signed 4 of the top 5 players. This is especially within these last couple of years. This is where the SEC was really able to go in there and really grab a lot of high caliber players. In 2025, this past recruiting class, Alabama signed 3 of the top 5 players in California, all top 60 players overall. But now you fast forward to the class of 2026, and now we're having a little bit of a different discussion. And now there are certainly some different talking points right now, because that West Coast talent in the state of California, it is staying on the West Coast, and this 2026 class has the potential to be a very Big Ten heavy dominated class for like the top 8 players in the state. The number 1 player in the state is a quarterback, 5-star quarterback in Rider Lines. Very heavy lean to Oregon and USC right now. Michigan, fun fact, is also involved in that recruitment as well. You go down to the number 5 player in the class. That's where you get to Cody Green, who's currently committed to Oregon. 6, 7, and 8 are all corners. Number 6 player in the state of California, R.J. Sermons. He's committed to the Trojans. The number 7 player in the state is Davon Benjamin. He's an on-3 RPM prediction right now to Oregon, but USC is also a big-time candidate in that recruitment. Brandon Lockhart, the number 8 player in the state, is committed to USC. Now, I jump from number 1 to number 5 for a reason, because I want to highlight the number 2 player and the number 4 player right now. The number 2 player, Brandon Arrington. Boy, the more film that I watch from Brandon Arrington, I just drool, and a lot of other teams drool over his length as a corner and his pure track speed. Oregon and USC, very hot and heavy in that recruitment, but so is Alabama, and so is Texas A&M. Mark Bowman is the number 4 player in the state. He's a great tight end prospect from Mater Dei. Boy, do they have a lot of top-level players that played for the Monarchs that are in this 2026 class. Both Oregon and USC. I think USC personally is the favorite for Mark Bowman in that recruitment. But if Brandon Arrington and Mark Bowman go to the Ducks or the Trojans, 7 of the top 8 players in California will either play for the Quack Attack or the Men of Troy. And when you look at it from a Big Ten perspective, that is exactly what you want to see. You want to see the top players in California play for either USC or Oregon. With all due respect to the Washington Huskies and the UCLA Bruins, the Cardinal and Gold and the Green and Yellow, those are going to be the teams that are going to take home the best recruits in the state of California. Those are the teams that are going to take home the best talent on the Pacific Coast. Now, here's another reason why it's a death blow for USC. Of course, recruiting rankings and all of this is certainly one part of it. And the SEC maybe not being able to go in there and get as many high caliber players is one thing. But what does it mean for USC to get all of this talent? It means that they got really good players, which means that they're going to have really good football teams. And when USC has the investment from the top down, and they have really good football teams. They have as high of a ceiling as anybody in college football. I would argue, since realignment really started to kick into gear in 2009, USC and the market that comes with them in Los Angeles is the biggest add in conference realignment. I know Texas and the SEC is certainly a candidate as well. But when the Trojans are achieving their ceiling, they will become one of the Big Ten's best programs, and they will be competing for college football playoff berths. The Big Ten already has great programs with Ohio State and Michigan and Penn State and Oregon, right? Those are 4 teams that you can probably anticipate will be in a playoff discussion year in and year out. USC is a program that should be added to that mix. Having another high-quality, consistent 9, 10, 11 win type of team on the West Coast will do even more for high-level football games out there on the West Coast. Right now, of course, Oregon is that team out west, right? Oregon is the team that's certainly at that high level and competing at that high level, but the Big Ten knows what USC can achieve. The Big Ten knows really the gold mine and the sleeping giant that is the Trojans right now. Like the facilities that they're building and having the right people inside the building right now makes USC a contender to really be that type of program. And that is just another blue blood. That's just another team in the Big Ten that's going to be in contention year after year after year, and that just strengthens them at the top. The Big Ten Conference really should have those 5 high-caliber teams competing every single year to get into the college football playoff, and of course, you're going to have some of these other teams that really make their way in as well. But USC's recruiting success in 2026 might have the SEC's teeth chattering a little bit. Year 3. This is supposed to be the year. It happened when Matt Rhule was at Temple. It happened when Matt Rhule was at Baylor. This is supposed to be the year where the big jump happens for a Matt Rhule coached college football team. I'll say this up front. I am not super high on Nebraska right now. Now, could they win 8 or 9 games? Sure. Yeah, they could. But going into this season, they've lost a lot at key positions, and I'm not overly sold that this is going to be that team that's going to jump up like other year 3 Matt Rhule teams have been. But if they are going to make that jump, I've got 3 keys and 3 things that they need to accomplish in order to do so. Let's start first in the trenches. When Matt Rhule was introduced as the head coach of this football team, I remember the press conference at the practice facility, and I remember him, and boy, he sounded like a Big Ten head football coach, didn't he, right? We want to run the football. We want to be great at the line of scrimmage. We want to recruit and develop good players on the offensive line and the defensive line as well. The O-line and the D-line cannot be liabilities for Nebraska this season. Let's start first in talking about the offensive line because there's a potential that both of them could be liabilities, but for different reasons. Let's start first, like I said, with the offensive line. This was a group that was banged up last season. And really, this is a group that hasn't really played, as whether they've been injured or whether just the play hasn't been great. They have not really played as a good, cohesive unit for a while. Certainly since this channel was started in 2021. But you need this offensive line to really get the most. They really need to reach towards their ceiling. You really need a lot out of the transfers like Rocco Spindler coming in from Notre Dame at guard and Elijah Pritchett coming over there at tackle. Like those are 2 really talented linemen. And there's certainly other players that are going to be plugged in. What is going to be the status of Turner Corcoran and Teddy Parachka, like guys that have started games over there at tackle for Nebraska, certainly in the past. Because if you want to get, and we'll get to Dylan Raiola here in just a little bit, but if you want to get the most out of Dylan Raiola, if you want to get the most out of this run game, which is Emmett Johnson, who I really, really like in the backfield, you need this offensive line to at the very least be like a solid to a good offensive line, because I think the development of Dylan Raiola, you brought in and you spent money to get a guy like Dylan Raiola so you could raise the ceiling at Nebraska. If you don't have the offensive line, if these guys don't develop, because all of this, how it circles around, is so humorous and funny. The one guy that was kept from the Scott Frost coaching staff was Donovan Raiola. Now it's time for him to really step up and say, you were retained for your skills, not just because you were a connection to the 5-star quarterback we wanted. So they got to really step up and have a good offensive line, because there were times last season, like I said, they were banged up, they were injured, and I get that, but there were times last year where it did not go well, and Dylan Raiola was getting hit certainly a good amount as well. Now, it's different for the defensive line because almost everybody is gone. Like, you knew you were going to lose Ty Robinson and Ash Hutmaker running out of eligibility. But some of the transfers that left, like the James Williams of the world and the Jamari Butlers of the world, all of a sudden you look at that defensive line room and there's not a lot coming back. And we'll see just how many of these transfers are going to be able to step up into a significant role. On last week's show, when I talked about a big question is going to be entering spring is what's going to happen at the defensive tackle spot. And I didn't really see the Big Ten beef in terms of those 300-pound defensive tackles right now. I think it's going to come certainly from the edge. But you need a defensive line, I think, that's going to generate pressure. The Cameron Lenhart, Williams Winery, of course, the former 5-star that transfers over from Missouri, like these need to be guys that need to wreak havoc, specifically Cameron Lenhart. Like, he was a really good recruit from a couple of years ago. He's been a little bit banged up at times, and he hasn't maybe seen the field maybe as much as he's wanted to, but I think this is a big year certainly for him to really step up this season. Dana Holgorsen and Dylan Raiola, they need to get their confidence going. Like, we saw the combination that they can be as an offensive coordinator and a quarterback in that Wisconsin game last year, and we saw it really with Dylan Raiola throughout a lot of games last season. When he is protected, that's why I started with the offensive line, when he is protected and playing with confidence, he is a really good quarterback. But just like any true freshman quarterback playing in the Big Ten, you're going to have some peaks, and you're certainly going to have some valleys as well. Confidence, that's going to be the thing. You need to get started off in this non-conference schedule humming going down the field. Against Cincinnati, that game in Arrowhead Stadium, Akron, and HCU. This is when we want to see Dylan Raiola take that big step up that I think a lot of people expect him to make as a sophomore. Because now you've had a winter, 15 spring practices, and a fall camp with an offensive coordinator that Matt Rhule in Nebraska is very invested in Dana Holgorsen. I think we're going to find out a lot. Even though these opponents certainly aren't the greatest in the world, I think we're going to find out a lot about where the combination of Dylan Raiola and Dana Holgorsen is fairly early into the season. And if this team wants to take that step up, maybe pull an upset, and then, of course, continue to win the games that they should win, Dylan Raiola has to play at that top level. For Dylan Raiola to play at that top level, the offensive line needs to protect him, which, of course, was my first point as well. Now, I've mentioned throughout this specific segment how much is gone and how much may be transferred out of this Nebraska program, but you need to be able to lean on a group that is experienced. And the one area and the one group and the one position room that is very experienced right now is the secondary. And I think you need, for Nebraska to really make that jump up In 2025, you need to be able to lean on the secondary to make plays. They lose Isaac Gifford and Tommy Hill, but basically return everybody else. I'm talking Marcus Buford. I'm talking Sayer Wright, who I think is going to be really, really good this year. Malcolm Hartzog, Deshaun Singleton, and others on that defense. Because you look at the linebacker position, they're losing a good amount of players there. I talked about the defensive line as well back there as well. Like, they need to be able to trust somebody. And I think trusting an experienced group like the secondary is exactly what you want, especially in a new defense with John Butler there as the defensive coordinator. Nebraska is a very interesting team to really evaluate for me in 2025. I think there's a thought where they could win some of these games and they could get to 8 or 9 wins, but if the lines of scrimmage really don't hold up, and if Dana and Dylan maybe aren't gelling as much as, and you don't see that progression from Dylan Raiola, there's a chance that this team could end up at 6 or 7 wins again. It's going to be so much fun to monitor the Huskers through the spring portal and then into fall camp as well. It's spring practice season. Everybody is going 12 and there's a lot of optimism, and there should be a lot of optimism for 2 teams that formerly called the Big Ten West their home, because I think these 2 teams could really be candidates to be surprise football teams. Now, I want to say this right off the bat. This is not a discussion where we're talking about Illinois being a surprise football team. Like, if you're talking about Illinois possibly being a playoff team, yeah, then that's maybe a little bit of a different conversation. I'd put them in a tier certainly like with Michigan as maybe who could be that 4th playoff team from the Big Ten. But they're not surprising anybody. Okay, they won 10 games certainly last season. Indiana won 11 games last season. So they're not really involved in this conversation. But I got 2 teams that I think could maybe challenge for that 9-win mark, for that 10-win mark. You know, when you get past Penn State, Ohio State, Oregon, maybe like an Illinois and an Indiana, who are going to be some of those next teams that might rise up that people maybe aren't talking about enough right now. Let's start first with the Iowa Hawkeyes. Now, this was a team that went 8-4 last year, but I think when people really look around at the black and gold right now, they kind of look around and they see, well, Caleb Johnson is gone. He rushed for 1,500 yards last season. He was one of college football's best running backs, and people look at this and say, hey, he was pretty much their whole offense last year. And then they look to the defensive side of the football. You lose Sebastian Castro in the defensive backfield. You lose Nick Higgins and Jay Higgins and Nick Jackson, all conference, all-American type of linebackers, the heart and soul maybe of that defense. You might look around and say, hey, maybe some of the best parts of Iowa football are gone, but oh, ho, 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 those of you who doubt, you have little faith. Because as long as Kirk Ferentz is there, as long as Phil Parker is there, Iowa is going to maintain a level of consistency that they've been able to establish certainly over the years. I think when you look at Iowa being a potentially surprise team this next season, you have to start with the quarterback situation. This is the best quarterback situation that they have had since Nate Stanley nearly threw for 3,000 yards in 2019. Now, I get it. We are not setting a very high bar here, okay? You're throwing Spencer Petras out there. You're throwing Cade McNamara out there. Like, this is not a very high bar to clear. This is the very low hurdle on the track, so to speak. But Mark Gronowski coming in from I was about to say San Diego State. It's a different SDSU. South Dakota State, he's just a flat-out winner. He's put up some big numbers at the FCS level, and I think combining him with what Tim Lester certainly has to offer. Like, I think we found out Tim Lester certainly has this offense going in the right direction, and this is an offense that brings back, look, I know their wide receiver talent isn't outstanding, but they still bring it back in the second year of a system and a scheme, and that certainly doesn't hurt. Reese Vanderzee, I think Seth Anderson is back as well, Jarrett Bowie. Like, some of these guys, they bring in a transfer in Sam Phillips that's got track type of speed as well. Addison Ostrenga over at the tight end position. Like, I think they got enough there, and if you have a good quarterback to go along with it, and this is not going to be a pass-heavy offense. This is going to be an offense that is still going to be predicated on running the football. Iowa returns 3 guys from an offensive line that was very good last season for forming holes for Caleb Johnson. Kamari Moulton and Jazz Patterson are 2 running backs that I really like. Now, I think you're going to see more of those 2 guys be a tandem as opposed to Caleb Johnson certainly being the number 1 guy last season. So maybe neither of these guys rush for 1,000 yards. Maybe one guy rushes for like 900 and maybe another guy rushes for like 600 yards. I could very well see that type of system running the football. But I think that this offense is just going to be good enough. I think it's going to be balanced enough to certainly give some teams some troubles next season. You go to the defensive side of the football. Look, Phil Parker, you trust him. As long as he is running the show on defense in Iowa City, you have to trust him because they have built a tremendous defensive culture in Iowa City right now. Like, you look at the defensive line, it returns 3 starters in Max Llewellyn, Aaron Graves, and Ethan Herkett, all back. Linebacker. This is where people might say, well, you had Jack Campbell and Seth Benson as a combination, and then you graduated to Nick Jackson and Jay Higgins. Now what do you have, Ted? Now where's the strength in the middle of the defense? The strength is some homegrown Iowa talent that has been sitting there learning and developing behind these guys, Jaden Harrell and Carson Sharar. Like, you have guys that learn and develop that are from the state, that care about Hawkeye football. And then I talked about the trust that we need to have in Phil Parker. Look, are they going to be an All-American player? Are they going to be a first-team All-Conference player? Right now, I don't think it's going to happen. Okay, but I think you're going to have good linebacker play for Iowa next season. Xavier Wampa is also back in the secondary. And what's another thing we've seen over the last couple of years? Going from someone like Riley Moss to Cooper DeJean to Sebastian Castro, there's always somebody that comes up, a 3-star recruit, a 0-star recruit. That's the thing about Iowa. There's always somebody back there. There's always somebody that develops. They have an extremely strong culture of retainment. They recruit the right guys to fit what they want to do. Let's talk about the schedule right now for Iowa. Indiana, Penn State, and Oregon all come to Kinnick Stadium. And I'm going to throw this out there for everybody right now. Iowa will not lose all 3 of those games. Now, by saying that, he said, well, yeah, Ted, of course, the likely victory would be Indiana on September 27th, early in the season. But the last time Penn State came to Kinnick Stadium, I believe they were a top 5 team. I know, Sean Clifford got knocked out of that game. But the last time Penn State came into Kinnick, Iowa knocked them down. Oregon is going to learn how difficult it is and how underrated of a home field advantage Kinnick Stadium really is, especially if they're playing like in the late afternoon or the prime time slot as well. You play them in big noon, yeah, that crowd will certainly show up. They're going to get liquored up in the tailgate, and they're going to be ready to go certainly for a noon game as well. So having those types of games in that type of environment is going to be so fun, so fun. You look at the rest of the schedule, I think Iowa has a better roster than pretty much everybody else on their schedule right now. If they just play true to who they are, they step up the quarterback level, I think that this is a team that is going to potentially be on that 9 to 10 win level next season. Another team is a team that they share a trophy game with, and that being the Golden Gophers of Minnesota. Look, what have we known and what have we seen from PJ Fleck over the years? He gets the most out of his team. I've said before, I said last week, I think Brett Bielema is probably the best developer of talent in the Big Ten, or at least one of the top ones. I think PJ Fleck is right in that category as well. I think like last year I called him the king of the 3 stars, where he can really load up on a lot of these kind of mid-tier type of talent guys and develop them into future NFL players certainly as well. When I look at the Golden Gophers, I see plus players, future NFL players on offense and on defense. On defense, of course, it's Coy Parrish, a fantastic true freshman from Esco, Minnesota last year, who stepped up and did a really good job, and I think he's going to be the next great safety, certainly back there for the Minnesota Golden Gophers. You look on offense, of course, it's Darius Taylor, who rushed for over 900 yards and 10 touchdowns last year, and that was within an offense that was starting to throw the ball a little bit more, weren't they, with Max Brosmer over there. So I think now the quarterback situation really plays into Darius stepping up and finally getting over the century mark, I think, as a running back. Zach Pyron transferred in from Georgia Tech. Drake Lindsay is a recruit that's got that NFL body and got that NFL pocket passer type of frame as well. Like, that's the big question. But I think certainly early in the season, I think even throughout the season, this is a Minnesota team that's going to look to play PJ Fleck football. They're going to look to run the football. They're going to look to be physical. They lose 3 starters on the offensive line, so that's another question mark that they certainly have to figure out as well. But I love Darius. I like what they brought in at wide receiver. Like, you know, they lost Daniel Jackson, they lost Elijah Spencer, but they bring back Lemeke Brockington. You bring someone like Logan Loya, an experienced slot receiver coming over from UCLA. Javon Tracy put up some big numbers at Miami of Ohio. Malachi Coleman was a former top 100 recruit that was at Nebraska. If he can come in and they can get the most out of their potential, like at running back and receiver, there is plenty of talent out there for Minnesota to be a good offense next season. If the offensive line and the quarterback situations get figured out, I'm feeling pretty good. And then I move over to the defensive side of the football. They promoted from within. Safeties coach Danny Collins is now the defensive coordinator. Minnesota has a really good culture of defense despite having to replace coordinators. Joe Rossi left, and then they had last year's coordinator left and went to Miami, and now they got another new coordinator. But throughout all of that, Minnesota still retains really good play on the defensive side of the football. There's not really going to be a system change. There's not going to be really a scheme change on defense, and I think that's really going to help the Golden Gophers. That defensive line, they lose Ja Joyner, they lose Danny Strigo, but they return a lot of, I think, really good talent that's going to look to really step up to the next level. On the D-line, you look to the linebacker, Maverick Baranowski, Devin Williams are back. I know they lose Cody Lindenberg, but those are 2 good linebackers. I talked about the secondary, of course. Kerry Brown and Coy Parrish are great safeties back there. I think this is a very good defense coming back from Minnesota. We talked about what they certainly have on the offensive side of the football. I think that this thing can come together. I really do. You look at the schedule, no Penn State on the schedule, no Illinois on the schedule, no Michigan on the schedule, no Indiana on the schedule. Now, they got to go to Ohio State, and they got to go to Oregon. So that puts a lot of pressure on them the rest of the season to go 10-2. But I think outside of that Iowa game, this is a Minnesota team that probably has a better roster than a lot of teams on their schedule. And they get a lot of the 50-50 games in Dinkytown, which is going to help them out certainly this season. I like Iowa. I like Minnesota to potentially be surprise teams to really break through in the Big Ten Conference this season. Spring is upon us. Much more content certainly coming on down the pike here on Big Nation and Big Ten Ted. Until next time, I'm Big Ten Ted. We'll see you in the next one.